When I heard her words, I felt my heart tighten like a fist inside my chest. You're not even half the woman my mother is. I pushed my chair back slowly, trying to feel the floor beneath my feet, to remind myself that I wasn't dreaming, that the room wasn't spinning. My daughter-in-law's eyes were bright with that sharp, unyielding certainty she always carried, the kind that left little room for doubt or kindness. The afternoon sun slanted through the curtains, painting streaks of gold across the kitchen table, but the warmth didn't reach me. Instead, I felt cold, a creeping chill that traveled along my spine. I wanted to say something, anything, but my throat seemed to have shrunk overnight, leaving only a dry scratch behind. I could hear the faint hum of the refrigerator, the clock ticking with meticulous patience, and my own uneven breathing. Outside, children were laughing somewhere down the street, a sound that once might have comforted me, now only reminded me of what I had lost, the calm certainty that this was my family, safe and predictable. You think that's fair? I finally managed, my voice barely above a whisper, yet carrying more weight than I expected. My son, sitting across from us, shifted in his seat, the scrape of his chair against the tiles loud in the silence that followed. He didn't meet my eyes. Not that I was surprised, he'd been avoiding real confrontation lately, skimming over discomfort like water over stone. Her expression didn't falter. Fair, she echoed, that faintly mocking tone that always made me feel like a child caught doing something unforgivable. I'm just being honest. Mom taught him everything he knows. You're new to this family. You'll never understand what it takes to keep a home, to be respected, to. She let the sentence hang, sharp and unfinished, as if the words themselves were enough to wound me. I sank back in my chair, gripping the edge of the table until my knuckles whitened. My mind raced, caught between disbelief and a rising tide of anger. I had spent years building a life around my family, nurturing my son, and extending trust to those I loved. And now, here was someone younger, polished, confident, reducing all of that to a casual judgment. I wanted to scream. I wanted to retreat. I wanted to hold my son's hand and feel the connection we used to have, but he was distant, frozen in the indecision that comes from loving two people at once. And my daughter-in-law? She was smiling now, but not the warm, familial kind of smile. No, this was one of those triumphant, self-assured smiles, the kind that said, without words, I've won. The air in the room felt heavier, scented faintly with the lingering aroma of tea I had made earlier, now cooling in its cups. I wanted to escape to the quiet of my bedroom, to the solace of my own thoughts, but something in me refused. I refused to be diminished, to shrink in the face of disrespect. My pulse steadied, and I drew in a slow breath, letting the tension roll out with it. I see, I said softly, yet each word held a subtle firmness. I see how you feel. Not that I meant she had any right to make me feel this way. But I needed a moment to gather myself, to think before reacting in a way I might regret. My life, my son, and even this house had taught me patience, and I was not ready to lose it yet. That evening, the memory of her words lingered long after the dishes were done, long after my son had gone upstairs to his room, leaving me alone in the dim kitchen light. I traced the rim of my cup, feeling the faint warmth, letting it anchor me. I thought about my own mother, a formidable woman in her time, wise, exacting, demanding, but never cruel without reason. And I realized the difference. My daughter-in-law had measured me, judged me, and declared herself the standard. But who gave her that authority? Who decided I had to live in her shadow? The first stirrings of doubt had begun earlier that week. Small things, an offhand remark about my cooking, the subtle rolling of eyes when I corrected a minor mistake, the way she lingered over my son's decisions as though I had no say. I had brushed them off at first, telling myself I was overreacting, that every new family member went through a period of adjustment. But now it was unmistakable. She wasn't adjusting. She was marking territory. And I would have to decide how I would respond. Would I crumble silently, swallowing insult after insult? Or would I confront it, carefully, deliberately, in a way that no one, including her, could dismiss? I didn't know yet. But I did know this: nothing would feel the same again. The days that followed were quiet, deceptively so. On the surface, life went on as it always had. I made breakfast, folded laundry, reminded my son about his appointments, and checked in on the little details of the house. The hum of normalcy was comforting, almost a balm. But underneath, a tension coiled tight in my chest, like a wire pulled taut. I found myself measuring my words around her, watching her expressions with careful attention, noting how her tone shifted when she spoke to me versus when she spoke to my son. Every glance, every sigh, every polite smile became a clue, and I became painfully aware of the subtle war being waged beneath our ordinary routines. I remember one morning, the sun just beginning to filter through the kitchen blinds, casting long stripes across the floor. I was arranging plates on the table when she walked in, her perfume, something floral and overpowering, trailing behind her. She leaned casually against the counter and said, without preamble, I rearranged the living room. The old setup made it look dated. I paused mid-motion, trying not to let my irritation show. Oh. I hadn't noticed, I said, my voice calm, but there was a tightness in it that she surely detected. She smiled, a thin, knowing smile, and added, sometimes you have to let go of old ways to see what really works. Her words were innocent enough on the surface, but the undertone was unmistakable. She wasn't offering advice, she was delivering a verdict. She didn't respect my way of running things, of keeping our home as we always had. She was already rewriting the rules, inserting herself where she didn't belong. I wanted to retreat, to leave her to her illusions of authority. But my pride, stubborn and unyielding, would not allow it. That night, I found myself lingering in the living room after everyone had gone to bed, running my hands along the edges of furniture I had polished, rearranged, and nurtured over the years. I could almost hear the echoes of the conversations that had once filled these rooms, my son's laughter as a child, my husband's gentle teasing, the quiet comfort of familiar routines. And now it felt as if someone had stepped in, uninvited, and tried to repaint all of it in their own image. It was during those quiet hours that I began noticing other small things, subtle changes that I had been tempted to dismiss. The way my son's calls were interrupted by hurried whispers, the sudden disappearance of family photographs from the hallway wall, the carefully crafted excuses when I asked about bills or errands. At first, I told myself I was imagining things. But the nagging sense of unease would not leave. My instincts, honed by years of managing not just a household but a family, were screaming that something was amiss. One evening, I caught her in the act of sneaking into the study while I was making tea. She froze when she saw me, a hand half raised as if to explain herself, but there was no explanation that would make sense. She was not just overstepping, she was searching, probing, perhaps even taking inventory of my life. I felt my chest tighten, a quiet fury rising beneath my skin. I didn't confront her then. I just watched, silently, as she retreated when she realized I had noticed. And in that quiet observation, a plan began to take shape, not one of immediate revenge, but one of clarity. I would watch, I would wait, and I would understand fully before acting. Evenings became my sanctuary of reflection. I would sit in the dim glow of the living room lamp, the faint smell of tea leaves in the air, and replay every interaction in my mind. I thought about my son, torn between the two of us, and about my own mother, who had taught me the art of patience and the quiet power of strategic response. I realized that the stakes were not just about respect or authority, they were about the soul of our family. And then came the first unmistakable clue that pushed my calm observation into a state of alarm. It wasn't words this time, but actions. A letter, misplaced, or perhaps deliberately left in plain sight, its contents hinting at financial decisions being made without my knowledge, agreements signed in secrecy, promises whispered in hallways where I wasn't allowed to follow. The realization hit me like ice water. Her reach was deeper than I had feared, and her ambition was not tempered by any sense of decency. For the first time in years, I felt the raw edge of betrayal, the kind that tightens the stomach and quickens the pulse. But I also felt something else, a resolve I hadn't felt in a long time. This was no longer about mere words or casual slights. This was about protecting my family, my son, and my home from someone who had no regard for the bonds that truly held us together. And so, quietly, I began to prepare, not for a confrontation fueled by anger, but for a confrontation guided by insight. I started keeping track of small details, notes in my journal, receipts, conversations that seemed innocuous but might later reveal their hidden weight. I became attentive to patterns, listening to tones, observing gestures, storing away the evidence of a subtle, growing intrusion into our lives. By the end of that week, I understood one thing with absolute clarity: the calm before this storm was over. Something had shifted, and there would be no turning back to the naive trust one once held. It was a Tuesday afternoon when I noticed it, the small, almost imperceptible sign that confirmed my growing suspicion. I had returned from the grocery store, the bags heavy with the week's provisions: fresh bread, ripe tomatoes, my son's favorite cheese. The house smelled faintly of laundry detergent and the lingering perfume she favored, an odd mixture that made my stomach tighten without warning. I placed the bags on the counter and went to check the study, a quiet corner where I kept the household accounts and important documents. Something had shifted. The papers I had meticulously arranged were slightly misaligned. A folder that usually rested atop the pile was missing. At first, I told myself it was careless housekeeping, maybe my son had moved it. But then I noticed her small fingerprints smudged on the edge of my desk, the faint smear of nail polish against the paper. I called my son gently. "Have you moved anything from my study today?" He hesitated, glancing at the kitchen doorway where she lingered, arms crossed, a thin smile on her lips. "No, Mom," he said finally, but I could hear the faint quiver in his voice. I knew then that the subtle tensions, the whispered remarks, the shifting of furniture and photographs, it was all a precursor to something larger. And I realized, with a sinking heart, that she was testing boundaries, probing the edges of our lives in ways I hadn't allowed before. The next days were a careful dance. I spoke with measured tone, kept my emotions in check, and observed. I watched her interactions with my son, how she flattered him, guided his choices, and subtly undermined mine. She never raised her voice, never outright insulted me, but the cuts were precise, like a surgeon's scalpel, small, deliberate, and designed to wound without leaving a trace of guilt. One evening, she commented on a meal I had prepared. "I didn't realize we were still eating like this," she said, lifting a fork as if testing it. "Mom would have known to add a little spice, a little flair. You try, I suppose." I paused mid-bite, letting her words linger. The sound of the ticking clock was louder than I had noticed before. I felt my son's gaze, worried and uncertain, and I realized he was caught in the middle of a war he hadn't even known had begun. My hands gripped the table, nails pressing into the polished wood. I wanted to respond with sharpness, to tell her that respect was not a birthright, but a mutual understanding. Instead, I simply nodded, allowing the silence to fill the room with a tension thicker than any words could carry. But the subtle remarks weren't the only sign. There were financial matters too. Bills that had been in order for decades suddenly showed discrepancies. Bank statements appeared altered, checks signed without my knowledge. At first, I couldn't believe it, surely, it was an administrative error. But as I pieced the puzzle together, the pattern became undeniable. She was asserting control over my son, our home, our family finances, all under the guise of care and guidance. I remember the night I confronted her, not with anger, but with quiet, deliberate clarity. We were in the kitchen, the dim light casting long shadows across the tiled floor. I held a small stack of papers in my hands, enough to outline what I had discovered without accusation. She leaned against the counter, calm as ever, that same self-assured expression that had first cut me. "Do you realize what you've been doing?" I asked, voice low but firm. She tilted her head, feigning innocence. "I'm just helping. Your son, he needs guidance. You've been too lenient, too soft." I placed the papers on the counter, sliding them toward her. "This isn't guidance. These are decisions made without my knowledge, accounts manipulated, promises broken. You've crossed the line. Her eyes flickered, just for a moment, before she masked it with a small, practiced smile. I didn't mean any harm, she said. But the tremor in her voice betrayed her. She knew she had overstepped, yet she was unwilling to acknowledge the weight of her actions fully. I realized then that the conflict wasn't just about the present moment, it was about control, about respect, about power within our family. And I knew that handling this carefully was crucial. My son was still learning how to navigate between us, still unsure whose side he belonged to. I had to act not out of anger, but out of strategy, patience, and clarity. That night, I sat in my study, the soft light of the lamp illuminating the papers I had gathered. I traced each detail with my finger, noting the patterns, the dates, the subtle ways she had attempted to assert influence. I wasn't planning revenge, not yet. I was planning understanding. Knowledge was my ally, patience my shield. And as the house settled into quiet, the soft hum of the refrigerator, the ticking clock, the faint fragrance of tea leaves in the air, I realized something profound. I had been tested before in life, challenged in ways that demanded resilience and insight. And this was simply another test, another lesson in the delicate balance of love, family, and respect. It was 2 weeks later when the full scope of her betrayal became impossible to ignore. I had been patient, cautious, watching every interaction, noting every discrepancy. And yet, nothing could have prepared me for the moment when the truth revealed itself in stark, undeniable clarity. I came home early from work that Thursday, the soft drizzle tapping against the windows, carrying the faint smell of wet earth that always reminded me of my childhood garden. I had hoped for a quiet evening, a respite from the tension that had been building like a storm cloud over the house. But the moment I stepped inside, something felt off. The usual hum of domestic life, my son's music, the scent of dinner in the oven, was missing. Instead, there was a strange stillness, the kind that made the back of my neck prickle. I moved cautiously toward the living room, and that's when I saw them, my daughter-in-law and a man I didn't know, seated close together, papers spread across the coffee table. The casual familiarity between them, the quiet, intimate gestures, the hushed, urgent tone of their conversation, struck me like a physical blow. I froze in the doorway, heart hammering, senses straining. This wasn't just interference in household affairs, this was betrayal on a scale I hadn't imagined. For a moment, I didn't move. I listened to snippets of their conversation, references to accounts, investments, and promises made without my knowledge. Her voice, the voice I had once thought so innocent, now carried the weight of calculated deception. "We'll finalize it before anyone notices," she said, her words crisp and precise. "He trusts me to handle this. Your mother, she wouldn't understand." Every syllable cut deep. She had not only undermined me emotionally but had been actively manipulating my son's life behind my back. My hands clenched into fists at my sides, nails biting into my palms. I wanted to step forward, to confront them, to demand an explanation. But something stopped me. The fury inside me simmered, but I controlled it, letting it burn quietly rather than explode. When I finally spoke, my voice was calm, deliberately so. "Excuse me," I said, and both of them looked up, startled. The man's expression was one of polite confusion, hers was a flicker of annoyance, quickly masked. "What are you doing here?" She straightened, trying to meet my gaze. "Mom," she said, feigning innocence, "I can explain." But I didn't allow her the comfort of a soft excuse. I placed my hand on the edge of the coffee table, leaning slightly forward. "I think I understand perfectly," I said, my voice low but steady. "And I think it's time someone else understood it too." The man's presence faded then, a polite retreat, and my daughter-in-law was left standing, her composure finally faltering. For the first time, I saw the mask slip. She wasn't just clever, she was vulnerable when caught, and that vulnerability gave me the insight I needed. Over the next hour, I questioned her, carefully, deliberately, letting her admit what she had done in her own words. The papers, the manipulated accounts, the decisions made without consulting anyone, everything came out. She tried to justify, to claim she had acted in our family's interest, but her reasoning was hollow. The emotional manipulation, the subtle undermining of my authority and confidence, the way she had inserted herself between my son and me, it was all there. By the time my son returned home, the air was charged with an unspoken tension. I let him piece together the truth himself, watching as his face shifted from confusion to shock to the dawning realization of how deeply he had been manipulated. He looked at his wife, then at me, and I saw in his eyes that first moment of clarity. This. I had no idea, he said finally, his voice shaking. I trusted her. And you will, I said quietly, once you see the whole picture. But right now, you need to understand that trust is earned, not given blindly. And when someone violates that trust, it has consequences. The emotional weight of the revelation pressed down on all of us. My daughter-in-law looked smaller than before, not because she had physically diminished, but because the illusions she had built were crumbling under the truth. For the first time, I saw her as she truly was, ambitious, clever, but flawed in the fundamental ways that everyone is flawed when they choose manipulation over honesty. That night, I went to my study and closed the door. I sank into my chair, letting the quiet wrap around me like a blanket. I thought about the journey that had brought me here, the small remarks, the subtle shifts in behavior, the growing unease I had once doubted. I realized that I had been right to trust my instincts, to observe, to hold back until the moment was clear. And though I felt the sting of betrayal, there was also a quiet satisfaction, a sense of moral clarity that only comes when the truth is finally visible in its full form. I knew the path ahead would require careful handling, that emotions were raw and relationships fragile. But I also knew that the lessons I had learned, the value of patience, observation, and measured action, would guide me through the storm. After the revelation, I knew that a simple confrontation wouldn't be enough. My daughter-in-law's manipulations had gone too deep, and her presence in our family had begun to fracture trust that had taken decades to build. I had to act, but not recklessly, not in anger. My response needed to be deliberate, precise, and rooted in principle. I spent the next few days observing, collecting, and documenting. Every conversation, every transaction, every subtle attempt at influence became part of a quiet dossier I was creating in my mind, and on paper. I kept my voice calm around my son, careful not to overwhelm him with anger or accusation. He needed clarity, yes, but he also needed space to see for himself. One morning, I invited her to join me in the kitchen under the pretense of preparing breakfast together. The smell of fresh bread and the faint aroma of brewing coffee filled the room, grounding me, steadying my nerves. I slid a tray of tea toward her, keeping my tone neutral. I thought we could go over a few things, I said softly, just to make sure we're all on the same page. Her eyes flickered briefly with suspicion, but she masked it quickly with a polite smile. Of course, she replied, taking a seat. I placed a stack of papers between us, carefully organized and annotated. These are the transactions and decisions I've noticed, I began, my voice calm but firm. Some of these were made without my knowledge, and some were misrepresented to my son. I want to understand your reasoning. She glanced at the documents, her composure slipping just slightly as the weight of the evidence settled around her. I thought I was helping, she said, almost pleading. I wanted to make things easier for everyone. I leaned back, letting her explanation hang in the air. Helping doesn't mean controlling, I said gently. It doesn't mean bypassing trust or hiding actions. What you did, it wasn't guidance. It was manipulation. For a moment, she was silent. I could see the inner conflict flicker in her eyes, part defiance, part shame. It was a pivotal moment. I knew that if I approached this with anger, the discussion would devolve into accusation and bitterness. But if I maintained calm clarity, she would be forced to confront her own choices. I understand you care for my son, I continued, but true care respects boundaries. It respects the history and trust that exists in this family. You cannot rewrite it to suit your ambitions. That's not love or guidance, it's control. She looked down, a subtle tremor in her hands as she fidgeted with the edge of the tablecloth. I didn't mean to hurt anyone, she whispered. I know, I said softly, but intention does not erase impact. You have to take responsibility for what you've done. Not for me, but for yourself and for the family you are now part of. Over the next few days, I began to set boundaries firmly but quietly. I asked to be included in financial decisions again, insisted on transparency in household matters, and encouraged my son to be fully aware of every choice made on his behalf. I didn't shout, I didn't threaten. I simply reclaimed what was rightfully ours, using patience and strategy rather than anger. And slowly, I noticed the shift. My daughter-in-law began to pull back, her attempts to manipulate becoming less frequent. She was still clever, still ambitious, but she was now operating under the reality that her actions had consequences. My son, for his part, began to see the situation clearly, the fog lifting from the influence she had wielded over him. One evening, as I tidied the kitchen after dinner, I caught a glimpse of her in the hallway, pausing, perhaps reflecting on the conversations we had had, the boundaries we had established. I realized that confrontation didn't always have to be loud to be effective. Sometimes, quiet resolve and measured action were stronger than any outburst. I poured myself a cup of tea and inhaled the comforting aroma. The warmth filled me, grounding me in the knowledge that justice doesn't always come through punishment, it often comes through clarity, patience, and the restoration of balance. And in that moment, I understood that my role was not just to protect the family, but to teach, to guide, and to stand firm without letting bitterness define me. The storm had passed, not with destruction, but with a quiet settling of truth. The days after the truth came out were quieter, gentler, though tinged with reflection. The house felt different, not in its walls or furniture, but in the air itself. The tension that had coiled so tightly between us had loosened, leaving space for thought, understanding, and even healing. I found myself returning to routines I had once taken for granted. Cooking meals, tidying the living room, tending to small chores, these acts, simple as they were, became anchors of calm. My son was more present, attentive in ways I hadn't expected. He would pause to ask my opinion on household matters, on financial decisions, on family plans. There was a mutual respect restored, a bridge rebuilt through honesty and quiet insistence. My daughter-in-law, too, began to shift, not instantly, not perfectly, but noticeably. I watched her interact with my son with more openness, more transparency. There were moments of awkwardness, a hesitance that spoke of lessons learned the hard way. And yet, there were also moments of effort, small gestures that suggested she was trying to understand, to integrate into the family without overriding it. One evening, as the golden light of the setting sun poured through the kitchen window, she came to me while I was arranging flowers in a vase. Her hands were tentative, the same hands that had once fidgeted nervously under scrutiny. I want to apologize, she said quietly. I see now how my actions affected everyone. I didn't mean harm, but I understand that intention doesn't erase impact. I looked at her, measuring her words, sensing sincerity in the pause between her sentences, in the way she held her gaze without deflection. I accept your apology, I said slowly, but it's not just about saying the words. It's about showing respect, being honest, and learning from what happened. She nodded, a subtle tension leaving her shoulders, and for the first time since this conflict began, I felt a flicker of genuine connection. It wasn't perfect, it never would be, but it was real. In the weeks that followed, the atmosphere in the home grew warmer. Meals were shared without the undercurrent of unspoken battles. Conversations with my son became more collaborative, less strained. I found myself laughing quietly at small jokes, the sound of the radio in the background, the scent of fresh bread or coffee filling the kitchen, and feeling a sense of belonging that had been threatened but now restored. I reflected on the lessons this ordeal had taught me. Boundaries are not walls, but lines drawn in care and respect. Trust is fragile, easily broken, but reparable with honesty and patience. And, most importantly, resilience is quiet. It is not loud declarations or revenge, it is the calm, steadfast refusal to let others redefine your value or your worth. I also realized that family is a living, breathing entity. It bends and shifts under pressure, sometimes threatening to fracture. But when handled with empathy, insight, and patience, it can bend back, stronger and wiser than before. One evening, I sat on the porch with a cup of tea, the faint scent of jasmine drifting from the garden, and watched the sky darken to twilight. My son and daughter-in-law were inside, tidying up from dinner, their voices blending with the soft hum of domestic life. I felt a deep sense of peace, a quiet understanding that life's most challenging moments often teach the most enduring lessons. I thought about my mother, about her strength, her quiet dignity, and the way she navigated life's storms without bitterness. And I realized that her wisdom lived on, not just in me, but in how I chose to handle conflict, protect love, and restore balance in my family. I had survived the storm, and I had emerged not only unbroken, but with a deeper understanding of human relationships, of resilience, and of the quiet power of patience. And that, I knew, was the true victory. As I sit here now, the evening settling gently around the house, I reflect on everything that has happened. The tension, the betrayal, the subtle manipulations, they all feel like chapters of a lesson I had to live rather than read. And perhaps that is the point. Life teaches us through experience, often in ways that sting, but ultimately guide us toward understanding. I look around at the home, at the familiar objects and quiet corners that once seemed so ordinary but now carry a deeper significance. The kitchen, where conversations turned tense, the living room, where trust was tested, the study, where secrets were uncovered, they are still the same spaces, yet they feel renewed. It's as if the truth, once revealed, has breathed a quiet clarity into every room. And I think about my son, about the difficult position he was in, torn between loyalty, love, and clarity. I think about my daughter-in-law, whose ambition and cleverness could have destroyed relationships if left unchecked, yet who also had the capacity to learn, to adjust, and to grow. And I think about myself, how patience, observation, and quiet resilience became my tools, more powerful than anger or retaliation could ever have been. Life, I've learned, is rarely about victory over others. It's about holding fast to your principles, protecting what matters, and guiding those around you through example. Respect is earned, not demanded, and trust, once broken, requires honesty, effort, and time to rebuild. I leave you with this thought: how do we measure the strength of a woman, a mother, a family member? Not by loud declarations, not by control, but by grace under pressure, by clarity in the face of manipulation, and by the ability to restore harmony without losing one's own dignity. Would you have had the patience to navigate such a storm? To observe, understand, and act with deliberate care rather than rash emotion? I invite you to reflect on that in your own life, and if this story touched you, consider sharing it, subscribing, or leaving a comment, because sometimes, the lessons of one family can ripple outward, guiding others through the quiet challenges we all face. Thank you for sitting with me through this journey.